Today I'd like to show you the enclosure that I have for my superdwarf reticulated python.
Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
As you know, my reticulated python, Thomas Aristotle, he's about 8 months old at this point. And so I'm going to be talking about the enclosure that I built for him. It was actually a repurposed enclosure from something else, because I've had this thing for literally about 20 years. And so it was available, and so I repurposed it into a reticulated python enclosure. So as you can see, there are latches, and I already unlatched it just because they stick a little bit, and the door is open. So we have the entire thing is divided into roughly two sides, not intrinsically, just happen to be convenient that way. And so if you look over here, there is where Thomas Aristotle is. I actually fed him recently, and he's just finishing digesting his meal, but just hanging out up there on the top shelf. But to go through, one thing you'll notice, I don't tap him on the head or pat him or anything like that, because I never feed him through the front doors. As you'll see over here, there is the feeding door. And this thing, I'll show you the other side of it, it has an interesting setup where it's a sliding door. I had to build this as a thing to capture the door and make it a sliding door and so on. I never use it when I'm not feeding him, so unfortunately I'm not going to demonstrate that one. But anyway, over here, that comes out, and then if I back up a little bit, you'll see he tends to be on this branch right there in the middle, the nice horizontal one. He tends to hang out on that branch, and then when the food's, tends to be right about there in front of the door, and he actually comes down. He reaches from the branch, grabs it, coils it, and constricts it in the air, and then he, I only feed frozen thawed, but anyway, he constricts it in the air, and then he will even eat it, just dangling from the tree branch, much like a green tree python. So over here, this side, in addition to being the feeding side, is just sort of a general open area, and it's got some plants, two spider plants that are doing okay. If we go over here, you can see there's one spider plant it basically ended up not taking, and so I've recently introduced some pothos, which seems to be doing fairly well. Looking at the substrate, let me go through. On the bottom level layer of this, there's rocks over there. You can see the heating element, which is essentially heat tape, HTG, I think it is. HTG, forget the name at the moment, with plywood, and then bug netting, the very heavy-duty anti-pet bug netting on top, just to make sure you can't actually directly touch it. There's one water bowl down here and a hide in the corner, as well as up here some things to climb on. I'll show you more in a moment. But to take a look at the substrate, you can see on top is cocoa blocks. Then over here, let me show you. Under the cocoa blocks, like over here, we have charcoal that has springtails in it. Hopefully you can see some of them moving around. And then coming over here, it's a little easier to see. Underneath that, we also have, I wet it down a lot because he was in shed recently. It'll dry out a little bit soon. But this is Eco Earth, which is the very finely ground coconut, which sort of forms the bottom substrate, mixed in with a little bit of charcoal, and then the cocoa blocks on top of that. So I've got a somewhat, as you can see from the springtails, it's a somewhat bioactive enclosure. I don't have like the drainage layer underneath. I find the Eco Earth works pretty well, as long as you don't keep it utterly, completely sopping wet. It seems to work pretty well. Over in the corner, which I can show here, under the Eco Earth, I actually have a layer of plastic, where it's plastic sheeting, which I then taped in. But in the corners, they're folded, so there are no creases, so that I can do things like if I want to increase the humidity, I can just pour water in, and it can't possibly get out. So, to just kind of show what we can see from this side, there are rocks in front of the heating, these rocks, which is sterilized, of course, in front of the heating element. He doesn't use them as a rough thing very often, at least not during the day. And he never seems to shed on them. He seems to prefer to shed in other places. but they do also work as thermal mass. They warm up and so on. So like when I open the door and close it again, it's still pretty warm in here and the heater doesn't have to catch up too much. Then coming around to here, you can kind of vaguely see inside. This is what I call his privacy shelf. It is exactly the height of a 2x4, and I can get my arm in or use a snake hook if I have to. But he actually doesn't use this nearly as much as I expected him to. But it's another layer to go and explore and move around, and it's also, if you really want some privacy, you can go deep in the back. And then we get to what I sort of call the play layer. Then you can see he's just sitting over here, kind of vaguely wondering what's going on. He was tongue flicking just a little bit. Coconut hide, not really, he wouldn't even fit in the coconut hide. It's more just for interest. Got a second water bowl. Then, as you can see from, as we look along, there are a few more things, but this is kind of, there's sort of the most variety on this shelf. To look up a little bit, you can see the lighting. I use LED strips, which sit flush against the top to give lighting while taking up the absolute minimum amount of space in here. So I'm going to come around to show the privacy shelf. I'm sorry, not the privacy shelf, to show the play shelf a little bit more. Oh, this card, although the text is upside down, it has his information about his sire and dam. So this is just cut ceramic to form something of a hide. It's not a complete hide. It's more like if you just want a little privacy. Over here, this is half a PVC pipe. It's getting a little bit small for him at this point. I'm probably going to replace that soon. This hide here is actually a Chinese food container, the bottom half of it that I turned upside down and cut. And then he's a little bit big at this point. He fits in with lots of room, but he's big enough to move it around unless I weight it down. So it's weighted down on the one side with this, and on the other side with my 4-year-old daughter donated her fairy garden to be in the snake's enclosure. So it provides some extra plants and a little bit of interest, and sometimes he likes to, actually it's a little far forward at the moment. When it's a little further back like that, he often likes to hide sort of in the corner or underneath it. So this is sort of the play area, and there's just a piece of paper up here in case he makes a mess, although he mostly doesn't up here. Mostly he goes down to the bottom. There's the side of the privacy shelf that gives privacy, and then just to show this, these things are kind of interesting. He doesn't use them very much that I can tell. Kind of expected that he would, but I guess with the other branches, the bigger, taller branches that have the sort of rougher, nicer texture over there, he just doesn't use them very much. But if you take a look, these are actually removable. The magnets are very strong, but if you look, you can see it's attached via magnets to the metal plates. And so if I really desperately need to clean them or whatever, I can just take them out. Once again, this is a nice big water bowl. He never ever soaks in this. I never see him in it. I mean, it's getting to be not that big for him. When I first put him in here, it was much larger. I may at some point upgrade to a bigger one, but he just never shows any interest in water. I also have a fish tank that I let him, if he'd want to go swim in it, he can. And he never... one time he went into it and seems to have decided he doesn't like swimming. That's... Let me see here. Over here, there's just the... you can tell the heat probe that the thermostat's on that controls the heater. Although... that said, I did check that I ran the thing without the thermostat for like a good 24 hours at least, and while the hottest part of it got up to around 100 degrees, just under, and it got into the high, it got around, right around 100, very high 90s. That's only in the hottest part. The coolest part on the other side, because as you can tell, there's no heat over there, so this forms a thermal gradient from the one side to the other. Here, come back over here. On the cool side, it got into like the high 70s, I think. So something important to consider is just if your thermostat ever were to break, to make sure you're not going to accidentally cook your snake. And so that definitely is not possible. You can run it flat out continuously, and it doesn't cause any problems. So, the ropes, here just to show how I attach the rope. I took a piece of wood, drilled a hole in it of approximately just slightly narrower than the rope, very slightly, and then cut the thing so that there is part of it exposed. Then just put the rope in and put the screws. Let's see if we can get to the top there. You can see the rope comes out just slightly, and then just screw it into the side, going straight through the rope, and that holds it very nicely. And so the rope provides, just one more thing to climb. Got a vertical rope in there. He doesn't climb it very much because at this point he's getting big enough he can just reach anywhere he wants to go anyway, but it looks nice, and if he ever feels like playing with it, sometimes I take him out and use a rope to let him climb. It's fun to watch them climb vertical ropes. And yeah, I think that's basically all of its features. I've got, as Garrett Hartle sometimes talks about, using shelves in order to produce more horizontal space. And so I did a little differently. He usually runs the shelf the length of the thing and only partway through. I ran it the entire depth, but only a little over half the length. So it gives him a lot more floor space on the one side, but also over here, he's got more vertical space, so he can be higher up to the ground if he wants to be. And also it's just sort of more exercise to go climb up and go pull himself up directly from that side. So this is my enclosure for Thomas Aristotle, my 50% superdwarf reticulated python from Reach Out Reptiles. As I said, he's about 8 months old at this point. This is intended to be his lifetime enclosure. If he gets significantly bigger than I expect, then, I'll look at doing something else and, possibly adding another level to it or, whatever, if I really, really needed to. But I expect this should be good for him for his whole life. One thing I've noticed about snakes is that they don't even like to be straight. There's an exception. Reticulated pythons, when they're reaching for something, they will extend very straight and very far in order to reach another branch or something like that. But with that one exception, they don't like to stretch out. And so having a ton of length doesn't seem that important, nearly as much as just having lots of places for them to go. That being able to move around seems to me, based upon his behavior so far, more important than moving around in a sort of particular way, such as length. Now, if he got too big, then obviously this if he were to somehow get mainland size and he were to be a 12-foot long python that was 6 inches, 8 inches around, then obviously this would be too small. But he really doesn't, he's growing much more like the super dwarf parents. He's only about 4 feet long right now at 8 months. He's still very thin, muscular, but thin and muscular. He's got that sort of lighter body build. So, it's looking like expectations of what his adult size will be like will be fulfilled. And this should hopefully be a good enclosure. Plus, he spends a lot of time out of it as well. So this is my attempt to give him something interesting with lots of variety in terms of hides and and a nice big thermal gradient, so he can pick wherever he wants to be. As you might be able to guess too, with the privacy shelf being directly over the heater, and then this having and then the play shelf being 3.5 inches higher. If he really wants to be warm, if he super wants to be warm, he can sit in front of the heater, although I've pretty much never seen that. If he really wants to be warm, he can go inside the privacy shelf towards the back. If he wants to be warm, but a little bit less so, he can go in the privacy shelf towards the front. He seems to really like both the branch, especially this horizontal branch here. He seems to really like that branch, and he really likes the play shelf. That's where I see him spending most of his time. So that seems to be around his preferred ideal temperature. And measuring it, that tends to be right around 80, very high 70s to 80. Which again would be some of his super dwarf blood. As Garrett mentioned, these islands are so tiny that their temperature is dominated by the sea winds, and the ocean is always much cooler than the large areas of land. Even in the sort of latitudes of a bit north of Australia where they come from, and so they're actually more used to lower temperatures than than their like Indonesian cousins, the mainland reticulated pythons, and that seems to be borne out. Now, of course, he's, as I said, 50%. In fact, his mother was 50%, and his father was 50% superdwarf. Um, his mother was 50% Kayuadi, his father was 50% Kalatoa, and so being a grandchild, you get a lot more variability there than just than when you first mix like a superdwarf and a mainland. So exactly how he's going to come out is not entirely. It's harder to predict because he's the grandchild of that, and so he could take more after his mainland grandparents, or he could take more after his superdwarf grandparents. And so far, he sort of has that at least the slender superdwarf head, and seems to have the superdwarf build and so on. So anyway, but the point being, he also seems to have that sort of superdwarf temperature preference. That he seems to like the 70s more than the 80s. And when he's digesting, he likes it warmer, obviously. But yeah, so it's kind of interesting seeing, where he ends up. Sometimes he also just goes and hangs out on the floor, for example. So he definitely makes use of the enclosure. But he also, certainly has his favorite spots within it too. So, hope that's interesting. In case it gives anybody ideas for your super dwarf enclosures. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.